Time and relative.
Good afternoon, good morning. I'm gonna give it a few minutes, let some people to continue getting into the room here before we get started.
Hi, everyone.
Again, just want to thank everybody for joining us today. We will get started here in just a moment. I'm going to give it a little bit more time to let everyone finish getting into the room. Thank you everyone for joining us today. My name is Carrie Kernan and I am the Sales Development Manager here at TPGI. Thanks for joining us for our GAD Day webinar, Supporting a Technical and Cultural Shift to Accessibility, Whatever Your Resources, with Mark Miller and Matthew Atkinson. Just a few housekeeping items before we get started. The session is being recorded and the recording will be shared later this week after the event is over. Transcription and closed captions are available if you'd like to turn those on. And lastly, if you have any questions for our panelists, please put those in the Q&A section. We will try to get to as many questions as we can at the end. And with that, I will let Mark and Matthew take over and introduce themselves.
Hey everyone, and thank you so much for joining us. Happy GAD. I would say happy GAD Day, but that's redundant. We really appreciate all of you, appreciate you joining. I am Mark Miller. I'm the Director of Sales here at TPGI. We've been running a few of these throughout the week, and it's just lovely to see how many people are showing up. I would also like to introduce you to the man of the hour, Matt Atkinson. Matt, go ahead and introduce yourself.
Hiya, my name is Matthew Atkinson. I'm a Principal Accessibility Engineer here at TPGI, and I'm also co-chair of the W3C's Accessible Platform Architectures Working Group. And as Mark said, we are delighted to have you here for our presentation. And we're going to be talking about how you can get started with accessibility, whatever your resources. But just before we do that, we are going to talk a little bit about Global Accessibility Awareness Day. And then the main themes of the presentation are going to be how developers, designers, and the whole of your team can start working towards accessibility. And the last bit will be on the two most important steps to take in our opinion. So on to Global Accessibility Awareness Day. And the first thing is we have a question which Mark is going to introduce.
So our question is, and please feel free to answer in the chat, but what does accessibility mean to you? And when we say to you, we mean to you. So don't define accessibility for us, but tell us what it means to you. We've got some answers coming in. Matthew, we've got access for all. It means inclusion and equity. Got inclusion a few times. It means that everyone can participate in everything. Proactive planning for inclusion of all. Great answers. And thumbs up to all of them. I think they're all spot on. Ensure everyone can consume the content I create as easily and equitably as possible. Equal access for all. So I think you guys, everybody's hitting the all the themes that I would think of here. But what I would like to do, you guys can silently agree with me here, is I would like to hear what accessibility means to you, Matthew Atkinson.
Yeah, so I have a vision impairment, and accessibility to me, in fact, my thunder has somewhat been stolen because somebody's already emphasized the importance of this. It's not it's participation, it's equitable participation, and that means being able to consume content and understand content and be involved in that side of things, but also to create stuff. So authoring tool accessibility is a real passion of mine, whether it be game levels or web pages or documents of any kind, making sure that people are really involved in both sides of the process, the consumption of information and the production of it as well. So yeah, really, those answers really hit home for me as well. So thank you very much. And one thing to mention as well on the subject of questions, we are very open to questions. If you've got questions as we go along, please do put those in the chat or even shout them out if that's more accessible to you. Mark will be looking at them, and we will be taking questions as they come. Or maybe if they're going to take a longer answer or we think we're going to cover them later on, we will move them to the end. But we will do our very best to cover all of your questions. And there should be some time at the end for any questions that you might have. So just a bit more about Global Accessibility Awareness Day. The address for its website is accessibility.day. And on that site, you can find out a lot more information about the history of it and find other events like this one that are going on. And there's lots of stuff going on in person, virtually, as Mark said. Did you want to give a quick flavor of the other stuff that we've been doing for GAD? You mentioned you've been involved in a few events.
I don't even know if I can list off the top of my head everything, but I was, we had a wonderful panel discussion yesterday on the business of accessibility with a bunch of people who are in large organizations that have actually successfully been doing and maturing accessibility. I'd have to look at our list to go further than that, but there's a lot of good talks that have been happening.
Excellent stuff. Okay, well, let's move on to the main topics that we've got to talk about today, because there's a lot to get through. We're going to be talking about supporting accessibility, whatever your resources, as we've said. So there are some things that are really low-hanging fruit that are quite accessible to everybody and that you can get started with quickly. And there are other things that maybe come later, take a bit more time or effort or resources to achieve, but they're also really important. So what we're going to do is we're going to build up, and first of all, from the perspective of a developer, what can you do? And beginning just on your own, what can you do to further accessibility? Well, as it turns out, one of the most fundamental things in accessibility is the keyboard, because it's a tremendously important device for input and navigation. And a lot of assistive technologies, which we'll be talking about shortly, actually rely on or emulate a keyboard in some way to enable their users to navigate around the web. So if you can use everything on your site with a keyboard and you don't need to use a mouse at all, then you are hitting several fundamental important things. And this goes from making sure you can actually interact with the site to being able to see on the screen where the focus is and what you're doing. So make sure that you can be fully satisfied that you can orient yourself and navigate with the keyboard alone, and you're already a good step of a way there. And this is something that anybody can just test on their own, on their machine right now, because most people have a keyboard attached. And so it's really simple to do. So we have a diagram here that we're going to come back to every so often, and it's just showing the level of effort of these different approaches to testing for accessibility or supporting accessibility. And we're looking at developer stuff, and I've just put the keyboard on there, and it's in a fairly low down position because it doesn't take too much effort. And we'll keep building on this as we go forward.
One thing, if I can, Matthew, that I would just like to point out about the
Yep.
keyboard too, because I think you bring up a lot of good points, is we'll probably talk a little bit about how accessibility benefits all users, or has the potential to benefit all users. So as you're thinking about everything Matt said about keyboard accessibility, also think about the number of what I call power users, like my son is one of them, who really maybe they don't have a particular disability, but they, for efficiency's sake, they don't like to take their hand off the keyboard and put it on the mouse. So that keyboard accessibility actually becomes a better experience for a lot of other people as well. So just an example to keep in the back of your mind as we continue.
That's a really good point. And actually, one of the ways that I like to, it's a fun challenge for developers. Developers know that using the mouse is no fun compared to using the keyboard. So getting developers to be into doing the keyboard accessibility is not usually a hard sell, because they want to be quicker and more efficient at using the products that they're making. And there's actually a lot of stuff in the browser that doesn't need any installation at all for you to use to inspect the accessibility. Now, I'm just going to give some very quick examples throughout this presentation, just to scratch the surface. But here is a screen grab of the TPGI homepage, and we're looking in the accessibility pane in DevTools, and it's telling us how the search text box is being exposed to assistive technologies. It's being exposed as a text box, which is handy because that's what it is. And it's also been given the name of search, which is also correct. So this is a way to check that you're on the right lines with the structure of tables or grids or many different things. This is a really helpful tool, and it speaks to developers in a way that they understand. It's not a screen reader reading out text in a way that may be hard to understand. It's actually tools presenting data in a way developers can relate to. We also have TPGI provides the Arc Toolkit extension, which is free, and you can just install it if you have the permissions to do so in your environment. It's very easy to use. You can run it on a particular page and it will come up with potential or detected issues that might affect accessibility. So as a screen grab of it detecting a missing skip link on my own personal site, which will, if that is the case, will be fixed imminently. But it's talking about different mechanisms for skipping content, and it highlights some things that it knows to be a problem, as well as other things that might be a problem but need some human intervention. That this is a really fairly low effort tool to use. And then stepping up a bit, we've got other automated things like cloud monitoring services that go and crawl your site and run automated tests on them, and the knowledge base, which gives you reference information about how to implement accessibility. And whilst automated testing can only detect maybe up to about 40% of the whole of the standards that we look at, it is a good barometer of how you're doing, and being able to monitor it over time, again, fairly low effort, and you can see when you just deployed a new version, did that help or did that hinder accessibility? And you can use it to track the overall health of your accessibility efforts over time. So that's added another little icon to our diagram, a bit higher than keyboard because it's a bit more effort to include those technologies. They're relatively low resource, but you still need to go and actually use them. So that's why that one is a little bit higher up than the keyboard testing. And next on to the next stage, and I mentioned we're going to talk about assistive technology. These are the things that people use to access the web, either on the input side or the output side of things. And many of you will probably be aware of things like screen readers or magnifiers, which read out the text on the screen or make it larger physically. There's also things like high contrast mode, different keyboards, maybe one-handed keyboards or other sorts of keyboards, and things like dark mode even on sites. Really good idea to support that. And less well-known things like voice control. So that's where you can speak to the machine to control it rather than maybe using the keyboard or the mouse. And all of these things need to be thought about, but following the guidelines goes a long way to supporting these different assistive technologies. However, it's always a good idea to periodically at least use your site with them so that you know that it works. And of course, that takes quite a bit more effort than the automated tooling that we talked about. So it's a bit higher up again in terms of effort, but well worth doing on the journey to a successful outcome. Okay, so the next step up might be for you to get a manual audit done. So this is where some accessibility experts, consultants come in and perform a manual audit of the site. And that may incorporate some use of, probably would incorporate some use of assistive technologies and some of the other tools, but it would also involve the human attention to cover the majority of the guidelines that are out there and interpret those in a sensible way, like humans are good at doing. And the purpose of an audit is partly to catch problems, although you want to, as we'll talk later more on, you want to avoid the problems coming in as much as you can, but it's partly to catch problems and partly also to teach you where your gaps are so that you know where to build capacity in your team. So it gives you detailed expert feedback, but probably only on a sample of your pages or components, because the full thing would probably take too long. It gives you remediation advice, which can be carried over to other parts of the site. Some things will be very specific, other things will be more general. It does take a lot of time. So you get valuable feedback, but it does take a lot of time. And retrofitting in general is not a sustainable way to approach things, because you don't want to keep going around this cycle and retrofitting the same things. And we'll talk about how to solve that later. A good audit, though, is worth bearing in mind, will catch things that you missed or regularly miss, and that shows you where the gaps are in your team's knowledge and where to skill up. And it will also teach you those valuable skills, because it will be reported in such a way that's educational and talks about the general case rather than just the specifics of how to fix things right now, which of course it would as well.
Just want to jump in real quick, Matt, real quick on this, Matt, because you made some great points. And I want to kind of highlight them here, that a lot of people think of manual reviews in terms of showing them where they might be at variant to the guidelines and then what to do about it, right? The technical, how do I fix this issue? But Matt, you brought up the point that it can also give you great insight in terms of what you might need to do in your organization. So as we think today about like how to improve accessibility and how to do it as if, with limited resources, there's also this sort of flip of that, where when you do go and pay for something that might have cost you a bit of money, like a manual audit, make sure you're getting everything you can out of it. So take a look at that manual audit, work with your consultancy and really understand the information that it can give you that can help you move forward in your program, and do that in a very intelligent way beyond just what are the issues on my site and how I fix them.
Yep, absolutely. And that educational side of things is going to come back into it. So yeah, really good points there. Thanks, Mark. So we're going to put this on our chart. It's considerably more effort than the other things that we've talked about. So we're constantly building towards more higher effort, but also really high reward approaches. And the last one on the development side that we're going to talk about is having people test your site to make sure it works for them. And this is something that you'll typically only do when you really think that it's ready for that sort of feedback, or specific parts of it are really ready for that sort of feedback, because you're taking people's time, valuable time, for which of course you're going to compensate them, but it's still a big commitment for somebody to come in, especially somebody that faces accessibility barriers. You really need to make sure that the whole process is accessible from start to finish. And that could be the subject of many other webinars, but just to say that having people test it is really, really important. And it will give you a view as to what it's like to actually use it, rather than just how it meets the guidelines. And that's super important. So it's highly valuable feedback. It's real world experiences over strict compliance, but it should only be undertaken when you're ready, both in terms of the product that you're testing and the processes that you've got in place to support the people that are doing that testing for you. And of course, it takes time and effort to organize. You can partner with companies like ours, for example, or others, or you can, some people do it in-house. And you do need to make sure that you're providing an accessible and productive environment for that testing. But again, it's super, super valuable stuff to be doing. So we filled in the development side of our diagram, but all of these things, you don't want to have to keep doing them and catching the same problems. So how do you make sure that you're not going to be just cycling through these things forever? Well, what we want to do is we want to shift left, as we say. We want to move earlier in the design and the development process, specifically in this case to the design process. So we're going to reserve the other part of our screen for the things that designers might do to support accessibility. And that's what we're going to talk about in this following section. So designers already do a lot of stuff that really influences and can help accessibility. And I've always exclusively come across designers that really want to help people use their thing. Same with developers. People really want to share and have their creations usable by as many people as possible. So if you're a designer, you're probably already doing some of this stuff, but some of it may be some new ideas or perspectives to encourage you to keep going and keep thinking about the stuff that we're going to bring up. So without further ado, the first thing many designers think about is color contrast. And this is a very well accepted practice. It's a good idea once you've got your branding and your color palette to think about the different combinations. And what often gets done is known good combinations and known bad combinations get highlighted so that developers and other people in the team know which ones to use and which ones not to use. And also maintaining a set of known good ones also improves consistency in your designs. So this is something that you're probably already thinking about. It's also worth thinking about contrast, not just of text, but of graphical symbols and things. Maybe we'll have some questions on those, but for now, we will move on. Another thing relating to color is not using color alone to convey information. So if you've got a markets view, this is the BBC's website's markets view, it uses color and shape to indicate what's going on. A positive turn in the market is green, and it's got a plus sign in front of it, and it's got an upwards pointing triangle. And for negative downturns, you've also got red text, a minus sign, and a down pointing triangle. So there's lots of cues there to provide that information in ways other than just color. So color, something probably designers are really thinking about already, but maybe something there to think around in terms of providing color and shape and other ways to convey information. So we're going to put that on a fairly low effort thing to get started with. And the next one is thinking about the structure of pages. Now, designers are really good, and often we see wireframes about the way that pages should be structured and where different components will go in the page and all that kind of good stuff. And that's really important. And one thing to really think about when you're doing that is to make sure that the hierarchy of things on the page that's conveyed to people's assistive technologies matches the visually apparent hierarchy, which usually we would take to be the one that was intended, because people design visually generally by default. So what do I mean by this? I mean that it's a really good idea to make sure that your styles for your headings reflect the relative importance of the headings. You know, bigger text means a more important heading, but also it's worth annotating your designs to say what level of heading should go in each particular place. And when you really think about the level of the heading, which is what will be conveyed to screen reader users and other assistive technology users, so we're talking 1 is the most important, 6 is the least important. when you are conveying that information and really have to think about it, it might highlight occasions where you might be skipping one by accident, or there might be a place where a heading should be, but it isn't in the design, or anything like that. So you might find if there is a discrepancy between the visual and the semantic hierarchy of headings, that can tell you that maybe there's a gap there that you need to think about. So doing those annotations, making those annotations can really help to just prove your design. So again, it helps everyone. And similarly, in terms of structure with lists, where should paragraphs be, form labels as well, they're really important to demarcate and make sure that they're clear and consistent across the site. And then also landmark regions as well. Where are they going to be used? What is the navigation region on the page, or are there multiple ones? And if there are, what name are you going to give to each of them to distinguish them from each other? So things like that. And again, maybe time for questions on those shortly. So you're already thinking about structure as a designer, so we're going to put that fairly low effort level on the diagram here, but it is just vital to accessibility, just as it is for everyone. So it's really important to bear in mind. Now, something that, again, modern day designers are thinking about a lot, and that is responsive design. So you're not just designing for a laptop, or you're also designing for a phone or a tablet, or perhaps you're actually using modern CSS techniques to really focus the design on the content and have it flow to adapt to these different viewports, and you're not actually thinking so much about specific breakpoints in terms of viewports. And that's much more common these days because of things like fluid type techniques, where the font will enlarge or decrease according to the size of screen space available. So you can use techniques like that, and it is a good idea if you can to think about the content rather than specific breakpoints. But even doing design for breakpoints is really helpful, and it can be for accessibility. But one thing you might not be aware of is that there's actually no technical difference between somebody who is zoomed in a lot on, say, a laptop or a desktop display, and somebody that's just using a device that physically has a smaller screen, because the viewport, and the browser terminology for the screen at the current level of zoom and various other bits and pieces, but the viewport is effectively smaller when you zoom in on a desktop. You have less space to put information because the information gets enlarged. And there is, by design, no difference between that scenario, zooming in on a desktop, and using a device that has a physically smaller size. Why is that? Partly because the idea is really with the web to provide the content and then have the user, or the user agent, the browser in this case, display that content in the way that the user wants. If they need a bigger font size, give it to them and have the page reflow as a result. The other reason is that there's so many different variables in terms of zooming and screen sizes and things. To label some of them desktop and some of them mobile, it just doesn't really make sense. You might have some people on a mobile device that use a keyboard. You might have some people on a desktop device that use a touch input. So really, all these things are kind of separate so that the user can use what they need, what works best for them. And then finally, in terms of one question that we get asked quite a lot is how about, can we detect that the user is zoomed in or that the user is using an assistive technology? And that also is by design not possible. And the reason for that is because that's quite personal information from someone. And really, we should be designing the content so that it can be adapted how the user needs it, rather than giving a conditional, oh, we're going to give this content to screen reader users or this content to screen magnifier users. And lastly, on that line, how a quarter to a third of screen reader users can actually see the screen, and they use the screen reader to help them read the text on there. But lots of people assume that it means you're completely without sight if you're using a screen reader. So we make assumptions, and whenever we make assumptions, about the devices or the assistive technologies that can lead to problems. So considering responsive design, but in the context of there is no difference between mobile and desktop, and we don't know what assistive technologies people are using, largely it's the same as considering responsive design as you have, but make sure that you're not doing things like completely cutting off some functionality because you think the user is on a phone and they don't need it, because that is potentially going to exclude some people there. So there's quite a lot to think about responsive design. It's still something that designers think about a lot, but a bit more effort required there to really get that mix correct from an accessibility standpoint. And now we've got a couple more things for designers to think about that we find that it's not quite so common that these are taken into consideration, and it's understandable, but they do have a big impact on the user experience, especially for people using assistive technologies. So the first one is the keyboard. This is actually a picture of a piano keyboard because I've shown you lots of normal keyboards, but I am talking about keyboard input just like we were before. What's really important is if you as a designer give a developer a visual design and they think, oh, that control looks like a some sort of select box, and for some reason maybe they have to make it as a custom control rather than a native one, which is always preferred. When they make that control, if they don't get any cues as to what the expected keyboard interaction should be, they will do the best that they can, and they'll probably look at best practices and come up with something pretty good. But another developer, given the same information, but in a different part of the site with different constraints or different expectations, they might do something slightly different, but the control looks exactly the same. And if we don't specify as designers how people should interact in terms of keyboard interaction and where the focus should go, then we can get the same control, looks the same way, nice and consistent and easy to use for most people, but keyboard users end up getting confused because they have to use a slightly different mode of operation to interact with that control, depending on where it is on the site. So that for consistency and for accessible user experience, if you will, that is really important to bear in mind. And as designers, you all appreciate the need for consistency, and that brings about the feeling of it being robust and easy to use and predictable and all those good things. So it's really important to think about your keyboard interactions and annotate your designs with them. So we're going to put keyboard on there, but again, a little bit higher effort perhaps than thinking about responsive design, because it might be new territory for some of you. And the last one is something called name, role, and state. Now, we did see a little bit of this if you were able to see the screen grab of the developer tools in the browser. It wasn't just telling us the name of the text box earlier, it was saying it was called search. It was telling us the role, so it's a text box. And some controls have other information associated with them as well. So for example, a checkbox might be checked or it might not be checked. And that's its state, which state is it in, checked or not checked. Now, there's something else as well. It might have a value. So a text box will have a value. That's the thing the user has typed into it, but a checkbox doesn't. So there's all these extra bits of information that tell you, what is this? How do I use it? What's it called? And what state is it in? That information is often conveyed visually to us, and we just pick it up just like that. If you're using an assistive technology, it does need to be provided. And if you use normal HTML elements like a text box, like a checkbox, like a button, like a link, an anchor element, then that information is going to be there and provided. But if you're doing custom things like a button that's toggleable, not just pressed, you just press it and it triggers an action. If you want to press it to indicate that it's now pressed and it's in a different state to toggle something, that requires a bit more information. And if you want to make a completely custom control, like a set of tabs, for example, that also requires additional name, role, and state information. And there's a lot of stuff to unpack there, but you just need to know that this information is needed we need to be able to convey to the user, what is this control? So in the case of your designs, if the visual design is ambiguous and it's not necessarily clear what sort of element should be used to implement a particular control, is it a text box, or does it have some sort of autocomplete? Is it a date picker? Is it a list box where you can select one or multiple things? Those sorts of bits of information need to be conveyed on the designs so that the developer knows what sort of pattern to use to implement it. And there is a lot of information on the screen. There's a screen grab from the W3C's ARIA authoring practices guide, which gives examples as to how to make certain types of custom controls. And sometimes you can use HTML elements for this. For example, this one is a disclosure, and there is a native HTML disclosure element, but you might want to do something that that element can't do. And in that case, you would need to do a custom one. And this will give you a lot of help as to, in the generic way, how to implement a generic disclosure widget. Now, if you had an audit done and there were problems detected with your implementation, then you would expect to get custom specific information. How do you fix your disclosure widget? And that can be really helpful. But again, prevention is better than cure. So all these resources are available. And if it just takes thinking about them, and again, consistency, what types of controls are you going to use in what type of situation, making sure that you indicate these on your designs for consistency, and how you expect them to behave. And then the developers will have what they need to implement those in an accessible way. So name, role, state, and value information. Often you can get it from native HTML elements, but you might need to provide it with custom ones. And that's much more of an in-depth topic to talk about. So that's an extra step on top of the considerations that we've talked about so far, be they colors, shapes, structure of a page, responsive design, keyboard interaction, and now the ones we've just talked about. But one of the advantages of doing all this consideration up front and making sure your designs are annotated is that you will find that the effort required on the developer side of things that we talked about before suddenly decreases, because you're not detecting as many problems when you get to development and production, because you've already anticipated them. And again, just something to emphasize, this is really important. We always find that if people have made these considerations up front, not only do you get a more technically accessible site at the end, but the experience of using it is better because it's more consistent, it's more predictable, it's maybe less verbose from a screen reader user's perspective, for example. And that's really important because everybody experiences the UX in a slightly different way, depending on how they access the site. Most people experience it visually, but some don't. It's a combination of visually and audibly, or audibly entirely. And so we need to think about the UX for everybody and make sure that's smooth, and not just a case of, well, it's functional and you can get by, but it's awkward because it's inconsistent. We want it to be a pleasure to use for everybody. And thinking about stuff in the design process can certainly help with that. But there's much more going on in everybody's team than designers and developers. We just wanted to focus on those two because that's where there's some real low-hanging fruit, as I hope we've put across. But we did want to briefly talk about supporting accessibility across your whole team, of which there are many different people involved. And so it's really important to bear in mind that everybody influences and implements accessible designs and development and products. And this ranges from product owners to the designers, developers, QA, and your users who might feed back on changes that you might want to make. But everybody on your team does have an influence on accessibility. Even, for example, procurement managers who bring in maybe third-party widgets or internal tools for your employees to use, they need to be accessible. So there's accessibility in procurement. There's accessibility in finance, setting the budgets for the accessibility program. There's accessibility for product owners, prioritizing accessibility bugs in sprints, or having accessibility sprints, for example. Everybody is involved in accessibility. So we definitely want to emphasize that we've just focused on a subset here because it's where we see the lowest hanging fruit, but everyone is involved in accessibility and has a huge bearing on it. So bearing that in mind, what are the two most important things that you and your team can do to get started, just to get the ball rolling? Well, the most important thing is communication. You're probably not the only person in your organization that cares about accessibility, but even if you think you are, set up a channel in whatever tools you use to communicate about accessibility and invite people to come and discuss it. Now, of course, it's great if you've got top-down support from right at the very leadership of your organization to facilitate this time, but even if not, the grassroots is always required. So just set something up and give people a space to talk about accessibility or ask questions. And it's okay if you don't know the answers. You can share with each other what you know, and you can work through it with each other. And sometimes you will know the answers and you can give them straight away, and then everybody knows the answer, and it's something they can share with their team. And it's a good idea to try and find other people who are interested in accessibility, but there almost certainly will be, and they're probably sitting wondering what they should do about it too, and knowing that they, or feeling that they should, but they don't really know how. So if you just set up a place where people can talk to each other, it makes such a huge difference, and it shows people that there is willingness, there is some expertise, there is that passion to make things more inclusive, which we all have as people who make things. So that is one of the steps. And the second step is to just start doing it. Just start testing your site, your app with the keyboard. If it doesn't work, file a bug. If you spot problems with color contrast, file a bug. Talk to the UX people, talk to the designers, get that conversation going. Just do whatever you can, even if it's just at a purely individual level. And that example that you set quite often will start something off and start something going, and share your knowledge and point people to resources. Show them various Global Accessibility Awareness Day presentations from different organizations. Get them interested. Just start doing stuff. You'd be surprised how many significant accessibility programs at multinationals started by one person initially setting up somewhere to talk, and it snowballing from there. And sometimes that snowball starts rolling very slowly, but it does pick up. So please do just don't be disheartened if you think you're on your own. Just start doing it, and you'll soon find out that you're not. So in summary, talk about digital accessibility with your colleagues. It doesn't take a lot of effort to get started, regardless of your role. We've given you a number of different tips here, really instant stuff to get started. Keyboard testing and developer tools for developers, and thinking about structure and keyboard interaction are really good things for designers to do. And thinking about accessibility during the design stage will lower the effort and improve the quality of the experience for everybody. And with that, we have plenty of time for questions, and we would absolutely love questions on basically any topic to do with digital accessibility is fine by us. So please fire away if you have any questions.
And while you guys are doing that, one of the points I want to make here that Matthew made is that, you know, there's the one option, the one thing you can't do is nothing, right? Do get started, and what that means, or not just get started or continue. And what that means for each one of you might be something different, but it's almost always a failing strategy to look at the large overall picture of what you need to do from an accessibility standpoint and decide you're going to tackle that. What's much more successful is, what is the next thing I can do? And I think one of the examples that Matthew brought up was that, hey, you know, it's nice to have leadership support. and that's critical to a good accessibility program. But if the next move you can make is to open up a channel in whatever communications program you use internally, and get one other person to have a quick conversation about accessibility with you, if that's your next little step, do that, right? Don't think, oh, I don't have leadership support, why bother? Do that, because, or file that bug, because as Matthew pointed out, everybody starts there. And the accessibility journey is one foot in front of the other, just like any other journey. And this concept of really coming in and tackling a bunch of stuff, it can be done. If you've got enough money to throw at anything, anything can be done. There's no light switch, but you can certainly accelerate the velocity of it. But outside of all that, even with no money, whatever it looks like the next thing you should do is probably what it is. All right. And I spent enough time on that to where we've got a few questions that people have had a chance to write now. So one anonymous person says, how about discussing digital assets beyond the web, actual documents and whatnot? So I will say that obviously, when you think about your digital assets, when you think about what's internal facing versus external facing, websites are a singular component to that. And document accessibility is one example, which can also be something on your public site, is really important. And the good news about document accessibility is that that type of content is, even in my mind, Matthew, you may disagree with me, but it's even easier to tackle than something like the web. And that a lot of the considerations are similar. So for example, if you're creating documents, color contrast is something you should think about. The reading order, the heading structure, is this truly a heading 1? And is the heading that follows it, should it truly be a heading 2? All those things apply. And then you have some other sort of low-hanging fruit, like I pasted in this really complicated long link to a website that, if you're reading the context of the document, you get what that website is. But if out of the blue somebody read that website to you, it would be confusing. Well, you need to put that in anchor text, which is super easy to do, right? You write some text that's very clear, website to Matthew Atkinson's, I don't know, Doctor Who fan site, and then you link to Doctor Who fan site, and everybody knows exactly where that's gonna go. Matthew, do you have anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, absolutely. +1 to what Mark said. Doctor Who is awesome. In terms of document accessibility, there is a lot of support from authoring tools. Like, for example, if you're using a word processor, using styles to indicate the semantics of this is a heading, this is a title, this is, doing that stuff enables it to make things like a table of contents. It also enables it to make sure that if you send it to PDF or convert it to the web, it will have the right markup, the right semantic information there about the structure of it. So in many ways, there are definitely tools there to help with that. But it's important to get into the habit of using those styles and things rather than doing the sort of manual formatting. And a lot of organizations, just from my perspective, but I suppose I'm very web biased, it seems like a lot of documents are being converted to web formats rather than being kept in archival formats for public consumption. So again, web stuff applies there, but you can definitely apply a lot of the web content accessibility guidelines to general document accessibility. You can even apply it to mobile applications. There are W3C resources on how to apply it to mobile apps, even command line apps. We're currently refreshing those. So you can take WCAG to other areas, and it is really important to ensure that your documents, especially internal stuff, internal procedures and things, are accessible to your own employees within your organization, because that is equally just as important on the enabling them to participate equitably in the production of the thing you're actually making for the wider public. And that's a really important question. But it also just made me think, making the designs that UX have made and the design people have made accessible to the developers is also really important. So making them accessible in the way that we're talking about, but also reachable and at the time that they need to reach that information. So for example, one thing that we found that's really really helpful to developers, often they have as an organization, you might have a library of common widgets or components or building blocks that the site is created from. And what's really good is, you know, often they have like a website that showcases those and you can see how they would look and how to use them and things. It's really, really important that in that site, you integrate the design guidelines on how to use them, when to use them, how to use them accessibly, because that is the point where the developer needs that information. And we've looked at organizations that were really struggling with that until all they did was just make sure that that information was side by side, and then it really helped. Or another one is the designs they're annotated designs, but they're behind a password for some reason, and you like just let the developers see them. You know, they need this information. So again, communication, it's break down the barriers between the different people in your team. And the more people from different roles you get into your accessibility chat, the better, because that will just help with that. People will get to know each other. I'll stop talking because we've got 9 minutes left, and I think there's some more questions.
Yeah, we have another. This is a good question from Emily here that I'm going to I'll start with, but I really think this is a great question. Do you have some specific recommendations for people who want to improve accessibility, in this case for website design and digital documents, but are hitting resistance from the people who control the systems? So my answer to this, Emily, would be, you know, we've sort of talked around this quite a bit. I don't know that I have like a magic wand for you to clear these people out and allow you to move forward immediately without any problems. But where we've seen this with our customers particularly be successful is when they do exactly what Matt's been talking about, and that is opening up the communications, getting, you know, you may be one person, or there may be 2 or 3 of you in the organization that are wishing that these barriers were taken down so that you could do this. And if you make that 4, 5, 6, 10, if that gets the attention to somebody in mid-management, and that gets the attention of somebody in upper management, or if you guys are squawking and then all of a sudden, you know, legal steps in and says, hey, or whatever the case is, right? We could sit here and speculate it in multiple different directions. And it doesn't even have to be limited to just that communication. You doing the next thing, you making what you can accessible, so that when this question comes up somewhere else and you point to it and say, well, hey, hang on a second, folks, I've been doing this for a while and this is what I've been doing. Now you have a voice in the microcosm of that scenario that can start to penetrate through these things, where you have resistance from the people who control the systems. And I will tell you, as soon as you start to get as soon as somebody in leadership comes on and says, we need to be doing fill in the blank, everybody immediately jumps in and figures out how to do fill in the blank. So it may take some time, but if you continue to be this quiet but growing voice, this quiet but growing resource, trust me, if you stay focused on it, eventually you will start to chip away at those barriers. Do you have any? We have another question, Matt. Do you have anything to add to that?
Just a couple of quick things on that. That is just so true. It can take time, but you will get there. You just have to, as you say, Mike, just do it quietly and steadily. And one of the things that universally seems to motivate people to make something accessible is if somebody's made something and they really care about it. You know, it's the thing they made, they want people to use it. If you show them a video of somebody struggling to use it, especially if it's somebody with a disability, a light bulb will go on and they will want to fix it. But yeah, absolutely what Mark said.
Great. Thank you, Emily. That was a great question. So John has a question as well here, and he says, and I think this is probably the last one we have time for. So he says there is a CMS or sorry, I'm going to start over. Is there a CMS or authoring tool that gives content editors reminders and hints about accessibility and allows for rapid remediation of accessibility issues? Matthew, do you know of any? So I don't know of any. I will say, like, we have a very extensive knowledge base that contextually ties into issues from our automated scanning tools. That's somewhat, I think, what you're asking here. But Matthew, I'd be really curious if you know of anything that kind of is more of it sounds like a CMS that's kind of has a guiding hand as you're building out. In this case, I think we're talking about something on the web.
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. One of the challenges is this landscape changes a lot, and there have been some efforts to make things like an individual rich text component, for example, for authoring text content accessible. And sometimes you will come across them, and if you're using a screen reader, it will tell you, press this key combination for keyboard help, but only if you're using a screen reader. It would be good to know about that if you were not using a screen reader. And then, you know, if we give feedback to the vendors, the developers of these, and then maybe the keyboard help appears whenever you focus it, so that everybody knows there's keyboard help. And so we're getting there on that side of things. I couldn't say any off the top of my head any particular names because I haven't used one of those for a while, so I wouldn't want to say something that wasn't true. But there are ones that exist that are aware of the need for themselves to be accessible. But in terms of creating guidance for people to author accessible content, that is something that, as I said before, I'm really passionate about. But that's kind of the new frontier for accessibility, because it doesn't happen very much. There are some very specific efforts that have gone in that direction, like, for example, some social media platforms will give you the option of providing alt text when you upload an image, but sometimes that's really hard to find. Sometimes it's less hard to find. It's not exactly got to the stage, I think, where you're really being nudged for it. So, and there's I mean, even ethical considerations there as to, you know, how much do you push somebody, and it's I think you've got to gently encourage to get the best results. But sometimes those features are there, but they're just not flagged up at all. So it's really impossible for someone who's in a rush to ever discover them. So it's a really good question. I don't know of any exemplars really, aside from isolated things like sometimes you'll get the hint about alt text. But as authoring tools in general, I don't use kind of web authoring tools that often. I usually work on particular bits of code in a code editor or components or things that somebody's already made, rather than be inside a particular kind of more end user CMS kind of environment. So there are efforts to make those more accessible, and again, they're kind of grassroots things, but I'm not sure really that we're totally there yet, but I think there is increasing awareness of it. But yeah, it depends on the CMS and what sort of editor widgets they use, and then what the policies are in terms of validating that content that's been put in. Our testing tools, for example, our monitoring tools can help you check that the design of the code, the markup that you've just checked in promotes accessibility, that's more code level stuff. I think very useful, but and again, our knowledge base can talk more, as Mark said, about general concerns. But yeah, authoring tools helping guide somebody who's a novice towards making accessible content is still quite rare, I think.
I think if you go to the beginning, back to the beginning of what we were talking about, a lot of the initial things like ARC Toolkit, those are the things that you should have riding alongside your development efforts that are really going to help you. And then there are checklists out there too that you can get your hands on that are going to help you make sure that you include things. The other danger is as soon as you do that and you give somebody that guidance, what happens is they don't do the things that are not covered by that guidance. So even if you had that level of guidance, you still would need to interact and test with the final product to find out what else you might be missing. So it's a very interesting question, and you can probably understand in the way we've sort of rambled on trying to answer it why it's not been answered by somebody else. All right, I think that is all the time that we have. So really want to thank everyone for joining. We hope this has been useful and helpful. Matthew, so much for putting this slide deck together and doing a presentation with technical stuff that I would be way outside of my ability to pull off here. So I really appreciate you coming in as a resource and doing this, and I hope everybody else does too. Happy GAD.
Happy GAD, everyone. Thank you for your time and attention and great questions.